People of the book, hello and welcome to the 2021 virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival. I'm Mayor and Festival founder Judd Ashman, your host for this evening's program. Before we get started, a quick plug to support tonight's author, Ben Golliver, by purchasing his book, not just from anywhere, but from our wonderful bookseller partners at Politics and Prose, one of America's premier independent bookstores. We have links to the books in the description, and I'll note that given all we've been through over the past year, it is so important to support local jobs and the local economy. We'll have more on that later. I also want to extend a big thank you to our 2021 featured sponsor, the David and Michael Blair Family Foundation, for their generous support. Now let's get started. Tonight, we have a treat for sports fans and particularly basketball fans like myself. Ben Golliver, the national NBA writer for the Washington Post, joins us to talk about his new book, Bubbleball, Inside the NBA's Fight to Save a Season. When the pandemic hit and we all went into lockdown, there was that moment when all the major team sports hit the pause button and it was unclear when they'd be back. 4 months later, after meticulous planning, the NBA tried something that, in my mind, really transcended sports and entered the realm of social experiment. They invited 22 teams to resume play in a bubble at Disney World, a restricted single-site locale cut off from the outside world. It was like some sort of dystopian science fiction novel. Everything in the bubble was monitored and regulated. Socialization, food, medical care, and of course, access. Ben Golliver was one of only a handful of reporters invited to live within this odd little biosphere, and his book talks about life, sports, and everything else that went on inside the NBA's bubble. Joining Ben in conversation tonight is his fellow Washington Post columnist, Jerry Brewer. Brewer is known and respected for his thoughtful, nuanced opinions and his knack for writing about people and exploring the human condition. He's received numerous national awards for his work and was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. This is the first appearance for both gentlemen at our festival, and it's an honor to host them. Everyone, please welcome Ben Golliver and Jerry Brewer.
Thank you so much, Mayor Ashman. Ben, look, I'm telling you, I have read this entire thing. I've made notes. I'm really excited for you. First of all, congratulations. And then just secondly, I got a million questions about this project. And maybe I can ask 10 of them or so at the time that we have. But I just wanted to let people know from kind of my perspective. I mean, this is a book that's for diehard basketball fans because we're talking about a situation in which, the NBA creates a bubble and it's just basketball. But I love how it's for the diehards on one hand, but then it's also for people who have this respect of kind of a history of a game. There's a epidemiology component to it and how they put the bubble together. And there's a societal component to it as well, and telling the stories of these athletes and how they were dealing with racial tension and an election and all of these other things while they were in the bubble. I'm amazed that under this umbrella, you were able to do it, and to do it without the perspective of being able to step back. If it were me, I wouldn't have wanted to write this book until like right about now. 9 months later, you went in knowing you were going to write it, and you were writing it in earnest as soon as you got out of the bubble. So to start things off, I'm wondering how you were able to elevate while you were still in that place mentally, when a lot of people want to write from a place of distance.
I'd say first, thanks, Jerry, for doing this with me. And also thanks to the mayor and to Gaithersburg for putting on this wonderful festival. The question about proximity was so huge to this project. I actually didn't go into the bubble last July knowing I was going to write the book. I went into the bubble last July afraid about coronavirus. Frankly, I've been living a really locked down life from March until July, hardly ever leaving my house, having all my groceries delivered, being as careful as possible. And there was just so much interest around this bubble experience. I was hearing from people across the globe. I mean, I'm talking Germany, Asia, everywhere. And a lot of the questions really kind of boil down to like, what's it like there? Are you worried you're going to die? Is this thing actually going to work? Is there going to be a big outbreak? What does it do to the sport if there is one? And then are the players comfortable being in this isolated environment away from their families and friends during a presidential year where, race is at the forefront of all the conversations and players are out in the streets protesting prior to the bubble experience? And so for me, this whole thing was sensory overload. It was a blur, like you're describing. There was layers to it. Basketball, of course, was front and center, but the social justice activism, there was a business component as well in terms of how much money was at stake for the league. And then, of course, the public health, pandemic hanging over everything. So I didn't want to take too much time after that experience to, go back to it. I was worried that memories would fade. The intensity of the experience might dwindle a little bit. And I wanted to just stay in the mind frame of go, 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 go. I mean, for example, when you had the Milwaukee Bucks, shutdown, which was sort of one of the most memorable moments of the bubble, they decided not to take the court in the aftermath of the Jacob Blake shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Within a few days, they've put the bubble back together. They've called Barack Obama for help. They've enlisted Michael Jordan to kind of assist with the conversations between the owners and the players. They've decided to turn all these arenas into voting locations for the upcoming presidential election. And then, by the way, 2 days later, Chris Paul, who's leading all of this, has to play in a very high stakes playoff game, which is going to determine, his team's future and the balance of their season. That was the bubble really distilled down. It was, just a complete one thing after another experience. And so I wanted to carry that momentum over into the writing process. And I spent a solid 2 months, night after night after night, reliving the bubble experience while it was still fresh. And, getting into a situation where this book could come out before the playoffs to kind of set the table for the upcoming postseason, but also serve as a time capsule for basketball fans, this year and for decades going forward, hopefully, who want to look back on this experience.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're right. The word time capsule, you're creating a moment in time, but you also, the challenge as a writer is to live for this to live. And in some ways, like, you're not sure if you can do it, but in some ways you're hoping that this is informing the future in a certain way, that it's not going to feel dated. And that was the amazing thing to me, is that as we are preparing for another NBA postseason, I mean, it doesn't feel like it's something that's just stuck in time, even though you're writing about a moment in time. So how did you do that?
Well, I would say another reason to write it while we were still in the pandemic is so that our day-to-day lives were still sort of the restrictions around that was still informing my process, right? So like I got back to California and I was really relieved to be home. And a lot of people had senioritis towards the end of the bubble, kind of excited to get back to quote unquote normal lives. And we realized pretty quickly after we left, like, life is not normal still. You go through the Orlando airport, my first experience after the bubble, and I was really nervous because people aren't necessarily wearing masks. They're not staying distant. They're not following all these same guidelines that I had to follow in the bubble. And, certainly the bubble experience bought the NBA some time to, get back to its planning process for the following season. But, they can't really have, true crowds in the arenas. The players still have to wear masks and live under these very onerous protocols. And so, it was a situation where, all right, well, if we're living in this once in a lifetime, once in a generation, type of environment where we can't just go into public whenever we want. There are no public gatherings. You can't really sit down in a restaurant and eat indoors. That was the time to write the book when you're still in that mentality of kind of being, caught up by it. So, for me, I think that the details, the specifics of what life was like in the bubble is what's going to help this have the staying power. So just to give you a rundown of some of the things that I had to deal with, I wore a necklace around my neck that was a proximity alarm. It would beep if I got too close to anyone else from a social distancing standpoint, right? I wore a ring that tracked my temperature in real time as an early warning sign, potentially if I was going to test positive for COVID-19 down the road. I had to fill out a questionnaire every single morning. Do I have any symptoms of COVID? And I had to communicate that through an app on my phone to the health department of the NBA. I had to get a test every single morning. I took 92 COVID tests while I was in the bubble, and thankfully passed every single one of them, just like everybody else did in the bubble. I mean, the list of things goes on and on. I had a tracking bracelet around my wrist that would let me in and out of the room, but also to the gyms where they were holding the games. There was 4 layers of security: Disney security, NBA security, local police, and local sheriff's department. On top of that, there was video surveillance everywhere and signs letting you know you were being video surveilled. One night I was walking just to get some steps and get some exercise. And I know, Jerry, that's one thing you and I share, using this pandemic to try to like really build healthy, positive exercise routines. So I'm just getting my Fitbit steps. An SUV comes up onto me and demands to see my credential, which has my picture and also my access availabilities around different parts of the campus. And just to make sure I was supposed to be there. If I didn't have that credential, I don't really know what would have happened, but it wouldn't have been an easy way out of it, right? So these are just some of the things that we had to deal with in the bubble. And look, it's a symbol for all of society, these new restrictions that people, have all over the country have had to deal with, and in some cases been really bothered by, the mask debate and all those kinds of things. So I think I just had it a little bit worse than the average person, but I wanted to write a pandemic story as well as a basketball story because when I look back on some of the biggest years, not only for the NBA, and I think this is one of the biggest seasons in NBA history, but also one of the biggest years in my life, there's no question 2020 for me is going to be probably the most memorable year of my entire life.
Yeah, and I think all of that comes through in your narrative voice. And I wanted to talk about nerdy writerly stuff.
Yeah.
Which we got the perfect forum to do this. Your technical decision to write, really what you did is you wrote a third person story in first person. You write the first person not from the standpoint of it's your Bubbleball memoir, but you wrote it from the standpoint of I am going to be your tour guide to their story in a lot of ways. And I'll inject enough of myself so you can see the humanity in the story. Was that something that came to you originally or in earlier drafts? Were you wanting to stick to third person?
It was a fascinating debate that I had to go back through as I was planning this project. So as you know, probably all but about 4 of my pieces for the Post, and really probably all but 4 of the pieces I've written in the last decade have been third person. That's just usually how we do it. I'm not a columnist like you, I'm a reporter. And so it's almost always third person detached. I went to college actually at Johns Hopkins for creative writing. So most of my training was not in journalism. I don't have a journalism degree. I actually never took a journalism class. So I was kind of self-taught on that front. Learned as I went, covering the NBA. But a lot of my training was in first person. I wrote poetry, I wrote nonfiction, fiction, as part of that program. And so it was kind of always a tool in my toolbox. I wanted to use it here for 2 reasons. First of all, I really wanted to humanize the players. And I thought if I brought myself into it, it would seem more like, not that we were peers, but that we were all in this together. And there's a real collegiality to the bubble community. People talk about each other as like alumni. A lot of the media members talk about that. It's like a sorority or a fraternity type of thing. And I couldn't fully explain why LeBron and Paul George would say this was such a difficult experience if I didn't talk about why it was so hard for me, right? And I put on weight when I was down there. I slept really terribly when I was down there. My anxiety was up. I felt isolated from 3,000 miles away from my family. And so if I was just detached and not including those details, it wouldn't have supported so much what a lot of the players were saying. And it was very easy for people from the outside to say, oh, come on, millionaire athletes living at Disney World, sunshine every day, boo-hoo, it must be so hard. Look, I think I'm a pretty, low maintenance type of guy. I got a 1-bedroom apartment and I got a Ford. I'm not trying to live with a silver spoon under any situation. It was tough. I mean, it was really challenging from that standpoint. The other reason why I wanted to go first person, though, was because I felt like this was a book for basketball fans. And I've been a basketball fan my entire life. I felt like I won the golden ticket to like Willy Wonka's basketball factory, right? And so I wanted every fan out there to share that same experience with me. So like I'm sitting courtside at these games like Rihanna or Jack Nicholson, pinching myself, looking around saying, wait a minute, like here's LeBron. I can hear him talking trash. I can hear him yelling to the referees. Like this is a basketball fan's dream. So I wanted that passion to come forward. And again, if I went third person, maybe you're not getting how much fun I'm having at the actual games. I mean, some of these days, Jerry, was crazy. I mean, we would have 8 Hall of Famers play in the same gym in an 8-hour period, right? And the craziest part about it was there was fewer fans for these games than I had when I was playing AAU basketball in 6th grade for the Beaverton Running Beavers in Oregon, right? I mean, we were drawing bigger fans than LeBron in the finals. So it actually felt like a private showing, like at the Guggenheim or at the Sydney Opera House, where LeBron's taking his games to these unbelievable levels. And I'm just hoping that everyone else out there is appreciating it and realizing, like, I'm watching him meditate before these games. I'm watching him warm up before these games. I'm getting sights and sounds that really no one else can see. And so I better spread that to the masses. I got to share the wealth here. I can't be selfish about that for my own personal gratification. And so that was a major goal with going first person here, is to take people into those viewpoints that they couldn't have gotten otherwise.
Yeah, I think one of the things that maybe friends have been able to relay this to you, or maybe it's something that I'm going to relay for the first time. It was a very strange experience for us who are outside of the bubble to watch some of the amazing things that happen. I think about when Luka Doncic made the shot against the Clippers, the game winner, the OG game winner, off of that just an incredible pass. Everyone will talk about the Anthony Davis Mamba shot against the Nuggets for forever and ever. But it was like, almost like you would see these and you'd be like, wow. And then you would be like, do I have permission to freak out? Because like this is not like our normal sporting environment. Like, this is not like Kobe, like pulling the jersey and pounding his chest after making a game-winning shot, or there's no crowd. Like, so it's like, did that happen in Disney, or did that happen like in outer space somewhere? And so it was like amazing, but then you were like, this does not feel like any of the other moments like this that I can remember. But it's still amazing. I think about Bam blocking Jason Tatum's dunk to save that game. And it's just like, these are some of like the most special plays I've ever seen. Right. And I think that's when the value of everyone from the bubble, the way they would report and tell the stories from there, it validated those moments in a way that we're not used to having them have to be validated, because there's just this shared experience in sports. And I feel this every time I cover an Olympics, that it's just special that you're there, but you don't know how the outside world is really responding to it. What was that like for you?
Well, two points here real quick. First of all, on that OG Anunoby 3-pointer, to me, that was the best play of the entire bubble. Just to give you a sense for how strange it was in there, I was actually walking back and forth. I had 2 separate seats during that series because there's just empty seats everywhere. So I could move possession to possession, timeout to timeout, and like get into a closer vantage point to watch these shots, so I could get like exactly where I wanted to be, whether I was videotaping or taking photos, or just trying to, hear what was happening on the court. Imagine that ever happening. I mean, you know how it is during the NBA finals. Typically they throw us up in the 500 levels, and, we're lucky if our nose don't bleed. And so that was, again, it was surreal for me being there, just like it was for people at home, because that's never going to happen again. We're never going to get to a playoff situation where it's like you can kind of walk back and forth, like, just picking and choosing any chair. In terms of the crowd stuff, that's one big takeaway from the bubble experience and this NBA season as well. Every cliche about the importance of fans has been 1000% validated. The 6th man, the 12th man, whatever it might be, all of those are now no longer cliches. Those are just facts, and we all have to take them as such, because when you're having amazing shots like Anthony Davis, greatest moment of his career with that shot against the Nuggets, and LeBron not trying to be a spoil sport in any way, his first thought after the game was like, man, I wish that had happened in Staples Center. Like, I really wish the Lakers fans could have celebrated that moment with him, right? It would have been so much better for him, so much more validating to have that communal response. And ultimately, that's what sports is all about, right? So I think ultimately that was one of my takeaways from this experience, which is, basketball belongs to everyone. And it almost reminds me of like some of these tourist destinations where like, they're debating whether or not to keep them open to the public or how do we protect them best. And I just say open door policy. I mean, with these arenas, it felt so special to be one of the few inside, but the entire time I was thinking, man, I wish there was 20,000 people here. And I really feel an obligation to share what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing with the masses, with everyone, because I think ultimately, basketball is a sport for the entire globe. And this was a case where it was boiled down into like a snow globe atmosphere, a bubble atmosphere. And that's just not the best way to do it.
Now, it's interesting when you think about some of the things that you were trying to do. And I think there were a lot of like arcs that you needed to close. And one thing that was pretty striking to me was just the moment in where we are in NBA history. And I feel like you started that. And then you kind of closed it right around the chapter about the Mamba shot. The NBA had a year that I think history is going to look back and say, this maybe was a year in which everything changed. And like, I don't know if it's the next quarter century or whatever, I think we will be talking about the NBA after the bubble and what it becomes. Kobe passing, David Stern passing, the China controversy. I mean, that's the craziest year and the heaviest year in NBA history. What were you trying to do in Bubbleball in framing that conversation so that we can evaluate the NBA moving forward?
I felt that before we even got to the bubble. I was right there with you, in part because I did a lot of reporting about Kobe Bryant's death here in Los Angeles, and like going to the crash site, talking to a pastor who's in the church across the street, and they're having their Sunday school when the helicopter goes down. And some of those vivid memories I'm never going to forget, right? The collective shock, the outpouring of grief across the city for the next weeks, months. It may still be going. If you look at how many murals are still up, people will still have flowers on street corners in Kobe's honor. So for sure, I felt the weight of it going in. To me, the bubble was like the salvation, right? That's why the word save is in the subtitle of this book. Like, this has been a rotten year. If they just hadn't restarted it, it would have gone down as the worst year ever in this, in the league's history. When you're talking about the financial impact, not being able to crown a champion and everything else. And so there was a real pride factor, not only from the NBA league office, but I think from the superstar players too, of like, look, we don't want to quit here. We don't want to give up. There's a pandemic and it shut our season down on March 11th. But like, ultimately, we have resolve. We're competitors. We want to see a champion crown. And so you saw a number of the players, get together around May and say, hey, look, we're in. Let's do this. It doesn't matter if we have to go live in these Disney World hotel rooms, which are typically for, families of four in the minivan driving down from the Midwest to spend their summer vacation. Like, whatever it takes, let's do this. Let's try to find a way to make this work and try to preserve the future of the sport too. We're talking about a 40% revenue hit this year, $4 billion for the league. I mean, that's an astronomical number. And like you said, it's before bubble and after bubble, right? The league had been skyrocketing in terms of revenue the last 10 or 15 years. And now it's really gone the other way sharply. So this is absolutely an inflection point. And so I wanted to, capture all these different stories, make sure that we understand, why is this year so important for the league's finances and its long-term trajectory? Why was it so symbolically important for them to make the sacrifices to go down there and to finish this thing off? Why did this particular title matter so much for LeBron as he's chasing Jordan, but also for the Lakers as they're trying to work through their own grief internally about Kobe Bryant's death? I mean, keep in mind, Lakers owner Jeannie Buss calls Kobe a brother. Lakers GM and president Rob Pelinka was his agent for decades. Kobe and LeBron were longtime rivals in debates about who's the better player and competitors for 10 plus years. Kobe kind of handed the baton to LeBron as the face of the Lakers when he came to LA. And then you had Kobe and Anthony Davis as USA basketball teammates, right? And so their grief was intense the entire season long. They dedicated the title to Kobe in so many different ways. And so I did think that was a helpful entry point into all of these wider non-basketball conversations about what the stakes were of this experience. And, I think that there's probably a chance we get 10 or 15 years down the road and there's a new generation of basketball fans who are like, wait a minute, LeBron won a title at Disney World? Like, what was that all about? That sounds kind of quirky. And you get the people also on Twitter now who say, oh, that's just a Mickey Mouse title. It doesn't count. And I couldn't disagree with that more. I think it's so important to remember what everybody went through to get down there. And, Michelle Roberts, head of the Players Association, was so committed to this project that she lived in the bubble for more than 3 months straight so she could have that personal touch and feel with the players along the way. And she describes it as maybe the most intimate experience of her entire career. She's been a famous DC lawyer for decades before she took over the top spot at the Players Union. And she's cherishing this experience because of the impact that she could have on the people that she's serving, the NBA players. So I guess that's a roundabout way of saying, like, even though there was no fans, even though there was these weird empty gyms, even though it felt surreal and there was these overbearing regulations, to me, it's the most memorable season I've covered for the NBA since I started in 2007. And the bubble playoffs and even the championship celebration, which was so extraordinary, unusual, that's the most memorable playoffs and finals that I've ever covered, despite these circumstances. And I think it's going to be like that for the rest of my life, frankly. I came out of the bubble kind of fearing the come down, Jerry. I was like, I'm not sure it's going to get better or more intense than this, right? Back to normal has its pros and cons, but it was just such an intimate and absorbing experience that I'll never forget it.
So when you take us back to that time, I almost feel like time has forgotten how much pessimism there was about this working. It's not going to work. You're going to Central Florida. Their cases are exploding. Florida doesn't care about COVID. It's not going to, what's going to happen? I probably wrote this in a column. What's going to happen if they get to the conference finals and they got to call off the season? It's going to hurt way more than calling off the season in March. Yada, 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 yada. This is an amazing medical story, how they pulled this off and the lengths that they went to. And you detail that as well. And that's a critical component to the book. And, again, like it's such a book for basketball fans, but like it satisfies so many other curiosities. And so take us back to just how they created this remarkable thing and how they were able to pull this off without having, they had a couple of scares, I guess, with Lou Williams, going to an Atlanta gentleman's club to get chicken wings, lemon pepper wings or whatever. But they had no cases of COVID, after they got the bubble up and running, which is just, it's a legacy that blows my mind.
Well, you'll remember this phone call we had as a staff, before the bubble, where we were deciding, hey, should we have people go report on this on site? And I think one of the points that came up as we were discussing was this idea of like, hey, if something goes wrong, we should be there on the front lines, right? Like, this is going to be a gigantic news story. And so in that sense, I was almost being thrown to the wolves. And I was pretty nervous going down there. I was right there in the skeptical camp that you're describing of like, will it work? I was tracking those Florida COVID case numbers day after day, seeing the spike and thinking, oh, no. Even how I got to the bubble was interesting. I was wearing a face shield on the airplane. I made sure I had a private car, which I would never do in a million years, get a private car from the airport. I stayed at the Ritz-Carlton in Orlando because I was like, the nicest hotel will be the safest. You're doing all these mental tricks for yourself to try to say, hey, this is going to be okay, even though we're dealing with a life and death pandemic, right? And so the anxiety was real for us. And I'm sure it was way worse for the decision makers because the blood would be on their hands, right? If anything went wrong, people are going to say, you guys chased the profits. You wanted to hold these games because you wanted to make money and you put people's lives at stake. And I think rightfully so. Those are the kinds of decisions all businesses had to weigh. And, this year it's been kind of uncomfortable to see the vast, quantity of players testing positive and missing time and the potential side effects for their careers. It's very difficult to weigh ethically, but you hit the nail on the head. The bubble itself, its legacy was going to be that it worked flawlessly from a health and safety standpoint. All those rules that I described earlier kept everybody safe. Now, it was tricky And the sacrifices were so great from a mental health standpoint that nobody wanted to go do it again. But on the health merits, they designed a system, top to bottom, that absolutely worked. And it was very, very restrictive. I mean, just to give you an idea, like what I could do on a given day, I would go to the mailroom, which was this incredible shipping facility where they had sent in all these different packages, and everybody, basically all their stuff would come in through there. That was the highlight of my day, going to the mailroom, going to check the mail, seeing if I got a FedEx package, because I could walk circles around the campus to get exercise. I could go pick up my food from a simple location that had basically drop off food. And then, at the end of it, sort of like a Chipotle style counter, where you could get your food. But there really wasn't anywhere else I could go besides the gyms. And so that's why I spent so much time watching basketball. I mean, of course, I was going to go down there to cover it, but there was literally nothing else available to me. And that's how they kept people safe. During the shutdown, I'll always remember this. 3 days without basketball was the first time these players hadn't played every other day for more than a month. They were exhausted. It was a lot of stress because it was the playoffs. I'll never forget seeing Kawhi Leonard grab a golf cart and just do donuts in this empty parking lot. Like he's a 75-year-old retiree there in Central Florida, right? Because he couldn't drive a car if he wanted to unwind. He couldn't, kind of go anywhere else or, go off campus, go ride some Disney park rides. I mean, that was not allowed. And so here's a player who's so fabulously wealthy and accomplished that he's able to fly in a helicopter to games in a normal season. And he's reduced to, I got to ride a golf cart in circles because there's nothing else going on. And that's how you keep people safe, is you just don't allow social contact. You don't allow activities indoors that are going to spread the virus. And then you clean the courts, incredibly carefully after every single game, before every single practice. And you keep everybody isolated and separated from each other. I mean, these players were strongly discouraged from mingling with players of other teams. It was a very isolating existence. And the guys who were introverts, who like playing video games, who are obsessed with the sport, those guys were largely the ones who succeeded, right? I mean, LeBron was kind of famously talked about as having more naps than anybody. He just slept through the whole thing, and then he woke up to play incredible basketball, and then he went right back to sleep,
Yeah, absolutely. LeBron is hugely important to this book. I mean, you can't write about the NBA right now without capturing LeBron. I mean, he is the generational superstar. And now he's sort of in his own Brady-like, how does he continue to do this at an advanced age?
Yeah, he's going intergenerational, right? I mean, he's stealing other people's generations.
No, it's pretty remarkable when you think about coming into the league. And I mean, we were still in 2003. We were still kind of at the tail end of the Shaq and Kobe Lakers, and we were just like right in the middle of the Tim Duncan Spurs, and all that he's been through. Over these past 18 years, in a lot of ways, I mean, this was a moment that he had to answer in so many different ways, and through him, you probably tell the most important stories about what all of those players went through in terms of they came to the bubble with great conflict about the country. Some of them came with broken hearts. Some of them came angry as hell. And, they basically negotiated the terms of coming back to this bubble around like some social justice messages. They wanted to be in that moment more than just basketball players trying to salvage revenue and compete. And you just mentioned the shutdown, and so everything built up to that moment, which was after the Jacob Blake shooting. The Milwaukee Bucks decided they didn't want to play, and then that shutdown. 2-3 days of the postseason, and then you get Michael Jordan. Barack Obama, all of these people involved in trying to figure out how they can answer the moment. To me, that will always be it. It's kind of funny because before we get to the Lakers winning the title, before we get to LeBron winning his 4th championship, before we get to like some of the meltdowns of the bubble with some teams, it starts with that moment, that strike, if you will. And it starts with the how in the world did they pull this off, without having any cases. And then it gets to the basketball. But like you use that word intimacy. You're in this moment with them, and you're having to relay these complex feelings that they're having. Take us back to that time.
Well, let me say first on LeBron, I mean, he was the alpha and the omega of the bubble. And when you go back and look at the quantity of topics he was talking about after games, put aside the fact that he's the finals MVP, chasing Jordan, all that, but you just look at the number of things that he was opining about very intelligently and very passionately over the course of that 3 months. It's wild. Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, George Floyd, voting access, justice systems that are slanted against Black Americans in particular, his personal fear of the police. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And gun control, presidential politics. He's weighing in on the 2020 election. He's, sniping back and forth with Trump at various points. There's nobody else who could kind of carry that burden and also play at that same high level publicly. I don't know of another modern athlete, at least in the NBA, who is going to be able to do what LeBron did. And he didn't have to do those things, right? Like he could have just gone down there and said, hey, I really want to win this title because I just watched The Last Dance and Michael Jordan looked incredible. And I think that he walked towards that burden. And that to me was really, really impressive. And it was a sign of his character, and I don't think that, given how challenging that environment was, personally, if I was getting questions like that on those kinds of topics every single day, I never would have been able to handle it. And I'm still not sure how he did. And I think it's a real tribute to him. Now, in terms of that, the shutdown experience, to me, that's the heart of the book. It's my favorite chapter in Bubbleball because it's the most important historically. There's no question. I try to walk you through that experience minute by minute, in a level of detail that isn't really present in a lot of the other chapters. Because to me, people might forget the Lakers win the title, but they're going to remember that protest. I don't know if it goes on the same level as like 1968 in terms of that's what always gets brought up. The fists on the medal stand. I think that's kind of iconic and will never really be matched in the same way, given just where America was at in 1968. But what the Bucks did was incredibly special and unexpected, frankly. Even among their peers, there was a lot of confusion in that moment about why are they not taking the court and how is this thing going to unfold? I will always say the most important playoff game that I've attended is the one that didn't take place. And I got there surprised myself. I sit down, put my iced tea down, my water down, charge up my headphones. I look up, the Orlando Magic are out there, but the Milwaukee Bucks aren't. And now it becomes this big question of, well, why not? Where are they? Are we going to be able to kind of figure these things out in real time? And it turned into a good old fashioned stakeout. I mean, I was wandering around that arena, peeking into the Magic locker room, trying to see what I could see. And, looking back at me was Nikola Vucevic, their star center, looking just as confused as I was. I walked down the hallway and the PR people are saying, you can't be here. You can't be here. And I'm thinking, oh boy, something's going down here. This is big. You get over to the Bucks locker room and you can, realize they're all in there. They haven't left yet. The bus is still there. There's only one way in and one way out. And now we're just waiting for them to come out and say what's on their mind about Jacob Blake. And, I had a newspaper deadline. I'm writing my story on my phone. The first version of it goes out and you've got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeting about it as a major moment in American labor history, framing it in that context. The next day you've got Jared Kushner, advisor to President Trump, coming out and saying, well, they have a luxury of being able to take a day off and really politicizing their action the other direction. It winds up becoming this giant political wedge issue. And, to me, I think that one of the biggest takeaways from that protest was the sheer anger, frustration, this idea that we can't take the court. We just can't do it. It doesn't sit right with us. We've got to make a stand. We don't care what's going to happen. We aren't worried about the fallout. If in that moment, if the bubble blows up, so be it. We just cannot handle this anymore. We have to say our part. And cooler heads prevailed that night and into the next day, and they were able to put it back together. But there was that raw frustration with the police officer who shot Jacob Blake. Now you can contrast that with the Breonna Taylor ruling, where it comes back, the grand jury, in Kentucky says, look, there's not going to be any charges in her death. She's shot at home. It was a completely different response from the players at that moment. You're about a month into the future. They're just exhausted. They're worn down. They are resigned. It's despair. And so I'll never forget the anger and the frustration and this idea of mobilization after the Jacob Blake shooting, contrasted with the we just can't take anymore. Why is this system so slanted against us? Why is this how America works? That we heard from the players following the Breonna Taylor ruling. To me, those are those two pivotal moments and clear contrasts that helped reflect how hard the bubble experience was for the players there, but also how hard it was for Black Americans and all Americans around the country to kind of keep processing this news last summer. And this actually goes back to tie to one final point here, Jerry, is why I went to first person. LeBron said it himself in a press conference. He called out a lot of the white reporters who were there and said, you guys aren't going to know what we're going through. This is what it's like to be Black in America. And he ran down what that was like. And for me, I love that he did that, because every time I was writing one of these stories after that in the bubble, and even to this day, I've always kind of had that privilege check, right? That moment of okay, think twice about how you want to frame this. Make sure you're using the right words. Make sure you're getting across other people's thoughts in sort of an unfiltered fashion. You're not speaking on behalf of them or twisting it in any direction, because he was dead right. And those players all felt that way. And this was a bubble environment where a lot of the media members were white, where all of the owners who didn't go down to Florida, a vast majority of those were white, where a number of the league office executives were white. And you had players living in confinement who were majority Black, in this situation. So the overtones there were obvious. And, I felt them immediately. And I wanted to make sure that I did right by the players and their protest in my discussion of the Milwaukee Bucks shutdown. And also, framed the importance of it by looking at some of the backlash that unfolded as well. And LeBron took a lot of heat. The Bucks took a ton of heat, and they held up through it, and they finished the thing off. And I think it was so important that they were able to put this thing back together and see it through to the finish line, because they weren't quitters, and they weren't broken by it, and they held up and they did it.
What was it like for you to experience that backlash while you're in a bubble? It's not like you're able to go out to the bar and hear people talking about it.
For me, I just try not to read my Twitter mentions, because I'm sure it got ugly, and in part because some of the original tweets that were unfolding, I was one of the first people to tweet, hey, they're not taking the court, and they've expressed a lot of frustration with Jacob Blake. And I could just tell by the numbers that this is not just basketball fans weighing in, right? I mean, this is all, people of all political persuasions hopping into this conversation with the take. It was just like a Colin Kaepernick, debate from previous years, but, arguably because there was fewer sports on when the shutdown took place. I mean, it was the number one story. It was on the front page of the Post. It was on nightly news programs. I mean, it was basically everywhere. ESPN was obviously leading with it all day long for 3 days because there was no games. And so to me, it was always about, okay, well, what's next? How are they going to put this thing back together? When are we going to get back on track? And I'll be honest, selfishly, it was also a good time to catch my breath, man. I was tired too. I had been going to games like crazy. And, I talked to Mark Tatum, the deputy commissioner of the NBA, and he was like, look, this was a well-needed break. And he's saying this, in September with a chance to reflect a little bit. He's like, we threw the schedule together. You can never predict everything. These guys were tired. They were emotionally drained and exhausted. And so we're in a situation where, it was better that people could catch their breath. And I felt it too, man. It was funny. I brought a giant Lego set down there, and I had planned to build this thing as a way to just kind of stay mentally balanced and just occupy my time. And that thing had sat untouched in the corner of my hotel room for more than a month because there wasn't even a down moment to get to it. And so, for a couple of days there during the shutdown, I was like, well, I don't have to be at the gym for 8 hours a day. Why don't I start working on this Lego set a little bit? And I needed it too. I'll be honest. It was a lot. It was really heavy, and you could feel their pain. You could see their pain. And we're in this mode right now where all of our interviews are over Zoom, this season. And players, their responses to the George Floyd verdict, or the Derek Chauvin verdict, I should say, in George Floyd's killing. I watched those videos, but I just didn't feel them the same way that I did kind of being 6 feet away from LeBron and these players who were saying, hey, we've got to protest, or the Bucks when they took their stand in front of a pretty big media crowd by bubble standards, and they read their statement, Sterling Brown and George Hill. I will never forget that. I mean, I could feel their nerves. I could feel their passion, and hopefully that comes through in that chapter of the book.
Yes, it absolutely comes through, and I love how you slowed it down, and I think you really, again, like you start things, and then throughout the book you're trying to like tie it all together. That effort to humanize these guys, it takes on a different dimension in that chapter. And I wanted to ask you just about that. I mean, you're essentially living on a campus, and it's a big campus, but I mean, you guys are all in that together. I mean, did you feel like, even with the social distancing and how careful you had to be, did you feel that you came out of that, knowing a few of these teams and these guys better than you would have even if you could have been in the locker room and had some one-on-ones?
So there were some, opportunities for one-on-ones along the way.
Rudy Gobert, I remember that.
Right, exactly. I was just going to say, I mean, there were some good opportunities for it, but it had to be under very strict circumstances from a health standpoint, right? So like you had to prearrange it. There was no just like walking up to somebody after a game and saying, hey, let's going to chat, right? I mean, that just wasn't really how it was going to play out. And so to me, knowing how weird this was, I kind of went in with a little bit of a fly on the wall mentality, right? There were certain moments where I made sure to kind of quote unquote inject myself because I felt like either questions weren't being asked or there was a certain angle that I just had to get. So the Rudy Gobert interview is a great one where I just wanted to say, like, what was your life like for the months when you're public enemy number one because your positive test shut down professional sports in America? And yet, I mean, you can't control that, and obviously there was a video of him, touching a bunch of microphones and being kind of goofy beforehand. And a lot of people were really upset at him. But so many of us were just ignorant to the virus before it really hit that I didn't think he should be singled out for his behavior on that front. So I wanted to talk to him and get his full story for the Post, but then also again in the book. And then also Doc Rivers, because he had been a part of a boycott situation with the Clippers and Donald Sterling's racist comments where they considered a boycott. And so I wanted to like ask him some certain questions in the lead up to the boycott, just like, did he feel it was coming? What's his advice to the players? And that wound up being really important because he was one of the key voices who helped put the thing back together afterwards, telling the players, like, don't let this one cop dash your title dreams. Like, don't let your entire life be defined by the actions of a cop in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Like, there's a better response than walking away and quitting. Some of those comments coming from Doc to me, they were really powerful to me. I'm not a player, right? So if I was an NBA player, I think he really would have hit me pretty hard to heart here. So, I think that I came away not with like a whole bunch of new friends and like crazy Rolodex, and I can go to these people whenever I want, but I came away knowing these key protagonists in ways that I never thought I would. I'm even just watching LeBron sitting on the sidelines before the games, going through the deep breathing exercises to get himself focused. Or Nick Nurse would take half an hour before his games, before coming to do his press conference. And he would need to almost like sigh and relax his shoulders and get him. Like, you could kind of tell he was trying to bring his pulse rate down, right? Because he was so invested and so competitive in those playoff moments. Brett Brown, he's on the hot seat, and we're, kind of boxed into these little offices where he's doing his post-game press conferences, and he's so uncomfortable. He's leaning back away from the camera, trying to create a little bit of distance because these questions are coming at him about his job, and he's undoing his neck buttons because, again, there's just a certain level of, discomfort to that experience. So, these are kinds of things normally in the playoffs, they're up on stages, then there's podiums, there's more distance a little bit there. You just wouldn't be able to feel people's emotions in quite the same way. And so, one of the pictures I include in the book, I'm sure you remember this one, is Joel Embiid grabbing the bridge of his nose as he's just frustrated after a loss against the Boston Celtics in the playoffs. It's just that classic feeling we've all experienced. You spill red wine on white carpet, right? And you're just like, why did I do that? Like, I wish I could hit the undo button. And, Embiid's actually a very expressive player, and he famously cried after losing a playoff series in 2019. And so we've seen flashes of that before, but here it was just that I could see everybody because I could go to every single game. And that was actually one of my goals. I went to every playoff game from the second round on because I wanted to track all of these stories simultaneously. And that is just impossible. And I don't think it could ever be done before. I mean, even Jimmy Goldstein, the legendary NBA superfan who flies private jets and sits courtside at all the playoff games, right? Even with unlimited resources, you can't go to 8 separate playoff series simultaneously. Like, it'd just be impossible if it's not at a single site. And so I wanted to take advantage of that. And, you know, I didn't want to tell the play-by-play of every single one of these games, right? I wanted to give you little just dashes and paint pictures of these key protagonists in ways that I was able to see them in new lights that I hadn't seen them previously.
All right, Ben, this is going to be my last question. I love asking this of storytellers. I call it the triumphant failure, okay? And I call it the triumphant failure because in writing, you've got this idea in your head, and in trying to develop a narrative to keep it together and all of that, you've got these directions on like what you're trying to do, why you're trying to do it, where you're trying to go. In the experience of writing, you inevitably go off that path just a little bit. But in allowing yourself to go off that path, I think sometimes you get to a richer place. It's more of a raw place. But sometimes it can be richer. So what was your triumphant failure in Bubbleball? Something you were trying to do that you had to ditch that wound up leading you maybe to a place that satisfied you more than you imagined?
Well, 2 things come to mind. First of all, there was a lot more Kobe in the first draft because I've lived here in LA since 2015. I mean, the guy hangs over the city in so many different ways. I mean, just like I mentioned earlier, the murals of him just being absolutely everywhere, but just the shared trauma of that experience. So I went through a bunch of different Kobe scenes covering him in his last couple of years, his press conferences where he's answering all these questions in 3 different languages and just being so brilliant, his attempts to find his footing in retirement, which we know is so difficult for a lot of these players. Like, that's part of the reason why they play until they're 45 now, Jerry, is they don't want to sit around and be retired. I understand it completely, right? So the pain of his injury, his Achilles injury. And at some point I realized, like, that's a different book. You know, there's going to be books written about Kobe. There is a book called Mamba Mentality right now about Kobe that you could really dig into his personal philosophy. And I didn't want to distract or have that overshadow too much the Lakers themselves and what LeBron was doing and what Anthony Davis was doing and how they had turned around this franchise in basically 18 months by changing coaches, changing executives, and all these other things. So if there was a real threat here that Kobe overshadows everything, it just turns into this love to Kobe book. And I thankfully had an editor who really helped me pare that back and said, here's the important moments. Make sure you talk about his influence on Anthony Davis and why he yells out Kobe when he hits that incredible game winner. Make sure you talk about why LeBron is quoting Kobe post-game quotes as they're getting closer to the finals, why he's making those allusions. Look at it through their lens as opposed to the Kobe first lens. And I think that was really smart. And I think it made the book better. The second thing that came through, I'm not sure I was able to fix it, but so much happened after the bubble. You had the election result. You had the pandemic getting way worse in December. You had the NBA deciding to not go back to a bubble and to rush into a new season. You had a whole bunch of players test positive. You had a whole bunch of games postponed because of health protocols. And then you had an insurrection at the Capitol, right? Where, again, the players are coming out and saying, this isn't fair. Like, look at how we were treated as Black Lives Matters protesters in DC versus how the insurrectionists are being treated as they're storming the Capitol and people are dying. This is a double standard in society, right? So I tried to cram all of those developments into a simple afterword. And look, I mean, that afterword, that could have been another 100 pages if you're talking about the kinds of stuff that we were going through during the ensuing 4 or 5 months. And so I think that was one of the only downside that I saw to having this book come out quickly was that these are evolving stories. And a lot of the threads that we've talked about today, the social justice activism especially, were unresolved by the time the book had to go to print. And so I tried to do the best I could with the afterword and, provide a little bit of like a post-bubble legacy discussion in terms of how will the bubble be remembered. But, I think you said this earlier, it's going to be judged 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now in different ways. And that's why I wanted this book to come out as the time capsule, because I think for me, like it's really hard to go back and read my own writing. And I had to do that for the audiobook. And sometimes that could be like nails on a chalkboard, right? I actually
Yes.
think I'm going to enjoy looking back on this 20 years. I'm probably going to laugh at a couple of the photos I included of myself. You know, I'm doused in champagne and I'm wearing this goofy mask before my flight. And, but I tried to give the real version of myself. So there's probably going to be some insecurity down the road about like, wow, you really put yourself out there. And, maybe you were a little too young and dumb with some of those decisions. But I think in terms of the story itself and what the bubble was and how it should be remembered, I think it's going to hold up brilliantly. Like I really do think the bubble itself is going to age like fine wine, and I hope that this book helps that process. Like I hope people look back at this and say, okay, this was one of the documents that really came out that put together these different layers and help it have a legacy and help have it be remembered by future generations of basketball fans and then people who just want to know what life was like during the pandemic.
Oh, I think it's gonna live incredibly well. I just appreciate being able to do this with you. I appreciate just being able to see you and talk to you, because we would have had so many more meetings, if not for the pandemic. But Bubbleball was, it's incredible in how it informs the future. I think this is the definitive, objective account of what happened. And I think it's going to be, for people who want to do those step backs, they're absolutely going to have to read this book. So thank you for taking the time. I'm glad we were able to catch up.
Well, thanks, Jerry. I'll tell you, your columns got me through a tough year. I mean, I don't think anybody nailed the pandemic better than you did. And I probably text you once every 10 times you write a great column to say great column. So just realize like there's 9 other times that I need to be texting you and I forget. But I appreciate you having this conversation with me. And, I think your columns are going to hold up on the pandemic amazingly well.
Well, thank you, my friend.
And thank you both, gentlemen, for a fascinating conversation about what before 2020 would really be just an unimaginable set of circumstances. And hopefully after we're done, we never have this again. But it's really quite amazing how the NBA handled this and all that transpired socially and epidemiologically. And I really can't wait to read this book, not only for what you guys talked about, but also because my favorite team made it to the finals of the Miami Heat. So I'm looking forward to some of the actual basketball stories in there as well. But I want to thank you, Jerry Brewer, Ben Golliver. And again, when you guys have books in the future, we hope to host you in person at the Gaithersburg Book Festival. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this presentation. We have an amazing lineup of programs for both adults and children throughout the month of May. You don't want to miss any of it. Please go to GaithersburgBookFestival.org and look over the schedule so you could plan the rest of your festival month. But before you go, we have a special message for you from the amazing author and bookstore owner, Ann Patchett, and her dog, Sparky. Enjoy, everyone.
I'm Ann Patchett here at Parnassus Books with my dog Sparky, and I want to tell you the importance of supporting your local independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. They are a remarkable partner with this book festival. Now, when a book festival is live, it's really easy. You just go to the table and you buy your book and then you go to the event. But when a book festival is virtual, it gets a little trickier because you're home and you might think, well, I'll just buy the book on Amazon. So I'm here to tell you, don't buy the book on Amazon. For one thing, Jeff Bezos has enough money, right? He's trying to colonize the moon or something. He doesn't need anything that you've got. Politics and Prose, on the other hand, they're your local independent bookstore, and you love them, and they bring you so many events. They work harder than any bookstore I know in their community. And if you want them to be there alive and healthy and well when all this is over, you actually need to support them. They are the people that are putting a tax base in your community, okay? So you have teachers and police officers and firefighters, and when you pay a couple dollars more for a book, you're creating jobs in your community. So enjoy your book festival, support Politics and Prose. Remember, Ann Patchett and Sparky, think it's the thing to do. Shop local. Thank you.